Ready for a deep dive. Today, we're going back to the early 90s.
Oh, wow, the
Yeah,
90s.
1993 to be exact.
Right.
We're looking at excerpts from this publication called the Indigenous World 1993-1994.
Okay.
It was put together by IWGIA.
IWGIA.
Yeah, it's a group that's dedicated to supporting Indigenous peoples. And it
Yeah.
basically gives us this snapshot of what was happening at what seemed like a pretty pivotal time for Indigenous peoples around the world.
It really was a pivotal time. I mean, think about it. 1993, that was the year the UN declared the year for the world's indigenous people.
Oh, right.
So there were a lot of high hopes.
You know?
A lot of people thought it was going to be a turning point.
Yeah.
And these reports, they offer this really unique glimpse into both the aspirations and the very real struggles that different indigenous groups were facing back then.
Yeah, you know what I noticed right away? There's this tension in the reports.
Oh.
Like, on the one hand, you have this huge global spotlight on Indigenous issues
Yeah.
because of the UN declaration, right?
Right.
But then, like, right away, the reports start detailing all this ongoing violence and oppression in places like the Chittagong Hill Tracts,
Oh, wow.
East Timor, Guatemala.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if maybe that whole UN declaration was maybe more symbolic than anything else.
Yeah, that's a really important point to consider. And actually, the IWGIA reports, they actually really highlight that gap between like the international recognition and the lack of actual change on the ground.
Oh, interesting.
Like, for example, take the Yanomami people in Brazil.
Okay.
They were dealing with illegal land invasions, the impacts of disease, all this stuff. And this is all happening while the world's supposed to be paying attention to indigenous issues.
So it's like, okay, the world said there's a problem, but that didn't magically fix those power dynamics that were actually causing the injustices, huh?
Exactly. It's almost like saying, okay, we acknowledge you have problems, but we're not actually going to do anything to change them. And you know what? Even the language of that UN declaration is kind of telling. Well, it says for indigenous people, not of indigenous people.
Oh, yeah.
It's subtle, but it kind of reinforces this idea that someone else is granting them this year instead of recognizing their inherent right to, to be heard and recognized.
Yeah, you're right. It's subtle, but it is kind of a big difference.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so we're seeing this disconnect between like words and actions right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
But what were some of the other big challenges that Indigenous communities were facing back then? Like, I'm seeing that the IWGIA reports, they really emphasize this link between the well-being of Indigenous people and their control over their land and resources.
Oh, absolutely. And, to really grasp that connection, we have to talk about free, prior, and informed consent, or
FPIC.
yeah, FPIC. It's this principle that's actually part of international law. And it basically says that indigenous people have the right to say yes or no to any projects that affect their land, territories, or resources.
So it's more than just saying, hey, you have rights to this land. It's about making sure they have a real say in what happens on that land, right?
Exactly. And in the early 90s, this principle was being violated all the time.
Really?
Yeah, you had mining companies, logging operations, all these big development projects just pushing forward without even talking to or getting consent from the indigenous people who are going to be impacted.
And we're seeing that play out in a lot of these reports,
They're
right?
all over the place. You've got the Sami people in Scandinavia dealing with pressure from these mining concessions.
Right.
You have the Inuit and other Arctic peoples fighting against those anti-sealing campaigns that were threatening their way of life.
Yeah, yeah.
It was and still is a constant battle to protect their lands and resources.
What I find interesting is that in a lot of these cases, the outside forces, whether it's a company or even like a conservation group, they justify what they're doing by saying it's progress or it's about saving the environment.
Yeah.
But those benefits, they don't always reach the indigenous communities, do they?
Right. Oftentimes, those communities end up being displaced or their traditional ways of life are disrupted.
It really makes you think about whose interests are actually being served in those situations.
It does, doesn't it?
Yes.
And that actually leads into another major issue highlighted in these reports: the fight for self-government and political representation. Back then, indigenous people were pushing hard for more control over their own destinies, and they still are today.
Were there any examples from back then that showed how the self-determination could actually work?
Yeah, Greenland's home rule government,
Okay.
which was established back in 79,
Okay.
that was really gaining attention in the early 90s as a potential model for other groups.
Interesting.
It wasn't perfect, but it did offer a degree of self-governance that a lot of indigenous groups around the world were hoping to achieve.
That's fascinating. What do you think were some of the things that allowed Greenland to reach that level of autonomy? Do you think it's something that could be replicated elsewhere?
Well, one big thing was that the Greenlandic people, they were united.
Okay.
They had this strong, unified voice, and they really advocated for their right to self-determination.
Makes sense.
And Denmark, they were willing, even though it was gradual, to relinquish control and recognize Greenland's distinct cultural identity.
Right.
Now, of course, it's a very unique situation, so just copying and pasting it somewhere else might not work.
Right.
But the Greenlandic example, it definitely provided some valuable lessons and inspiration for other indigenous groups who were fighting for self-governance.
But I'm guessing that path towards self-determination wasn't always easy, even when there was a model to follow.
Oh, definitely not. The reports highlight all these ongoing struggles and roadblocks.
Like what?
Well, for instance, in Canada, there were negotiations going on for Inuit self-government in the Nunavik region.
Okay.
And those were hitting some major snags.
Oh, wow.
It just underlined how hard it is to get real autonomy when you're dealing with governments that aren't exactly eager to give up power.
Yeah, it sounds like even when there was a willingness to sit down and talk, there were still these big power imbalances that made it really hard to make any real progress.
Absolutely. And along with these political struggles, the IWGIA reports also show this troubling trend of large-scale development projects that were having a devastating impact on indigenous communities.
Yeah, that really jumped out at me too. You see these projects being touted as signs of progress and economic growth.
Right.
But for the people actually living in those areas, the reality is often very different.
It is, and it's a crucial point. Take the Pipperwar coal mining project in India, for example.
Okay.
It was being praised for being super efficient, but the reports show that there was a huge resistance from indigenous groups who were losing their lands and livelihoods and weren't being consulted or compensated properly.
So it's another case of progress for some, but at a huge cost to these communities.
Exactly. And sadly, it wasn't just happening in India. These reports show that it was a pattern all over. From hydroelectric projects in Canada and China to oil exploration in Ecuador, indigenous peoples were being displaced and their environments were being damaged, all in the name of development. And it's not just, displacement and economic hardship.
Right.
These reports, they also reveal this really disturbing pattern of ethnic conflicts and human rights violations that were directly targeting indigenous communities.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking reading through these accounts.
Yeah.
Like in Guatemala, for instance,
Mhm.
the report talks about this ongoing repression and abuse
Yep.
against indigenous groups.
Right.
And then in Rwanda,
Yeah.
you have the Twa people
Mhm.
who were already marginalized, and they're caught in the middle of the conflict between the Hutu and the Tutsi.
Right.
It's like they were being victimized from all sides.
Yeah, it's a tragic situation, and what makes it even worse is that a lot of these conflicts, they're fueled by, land disputes, political manipulation, and just this deep-seated prejudice against indigenous people.
Yeah, and the report on the conflict between the Kuki and Naga in India,
Oh, yeah.
that really shows this. It
Yeah.
talks about how these ethnic tensions, they get worse because of competition for land and resources,
Right.
and that can lead to this awful violence.
Absolutely. And these conflicts, they often have very deep roots.
Yeah.
I mean, to really understand them, you have to look at the historical context,
Right.
the social and economic inequalities,
Mm.
and the political kind of machinations that are all feeding into the violence.
So it's not enough to just try to stop the immediate fighting.
Right.
You have to address these bigger, systemic issues that are causing it.
Exactly, you got it. And speaking of cycles, there's this other recurring theme in the reports that I find really interesting
Okay.
and also incredibly inspiring.
What's that?
It's the resilience of these indigenous communities.
Oh, yeah.
Despite all these threats and setbacks they face, they are finding ways to resist oppression and advocate for their rights.
It's true. Amidst all these pretty bleak situations, you come across these stories of courage and determination.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Zapatista uprising in Mexico.
Oh, yeah.
That was huge.
Huge.
It captured the world's attention.
Absolutely.
And it brought the situation of indigenous peoples in the Americas right to the forefront.
It did. And you know what? The Zapatistas were really smart about how they used media and technology to spread their message.
How so?
Well, think about it. The internet was still pretty new back then.
Right.
And they used it to talk directly to the world.
Wow.
It was groundbreaking. It let them bypass traditional media outlets and tell their own story in their own way.
It's a good reminder that even when you're up against these incredibly powerful forces, there's always a way to resist.
Yeah.
And it's not just about these big movements like the Zapatistas either.
Right.
The reports are full of examples of these smaller, more local acts of resistance, too.
Absolutely. Like the Lubicon Cree up in Canada.
Okay.
They were fighting for their land rights in court and through international advocacy.
Wow.
And then you have the Mapuche in Argentina protesting discrimination and demanding that their cultural identity be recognized.
Yeah.
All over the place, indigenous peoples were organizing, raising their voices, and refusing to be silenced.
It's really inspiring to see these communities, often with very few resources, finding ways to fight back and stand up for their rights.
Yeah.
They're not just victims.
Yeah.
They're actively working to create change.
Absolutely. They're drawing on their deep cultural traditions, their knowledge of their environment, and their strong community bonds to push for a better future.
So we've covered a lot, from those dashed hopes of the UN Year for Indigenous Peoples to the struggles for land rights, self-government, all these development projects, ethnic conflicts.
Yeah.
But, running through all of this is this spirit of resilience.
Absolutely.
As someone who's been immersed in these issues for a long time, what do you think is the most important takeaway from all these reports?
Well, the IWGIA reports, they make it very clear that recognizing indigenous peoples' inherent rights to their lands, their resources, and their self-determination, that's not just about social justice.
Right.
It's absolutely essential if we want lasting peace and sustainable development.
Wow.
Their voices, their perspectives, they have to be heard and respected in every decision that affects their lives.
It sounds like a call to action, not just for governments and those big international organizations, but for all of us.
It is. These reports, they remind us that the struggles of indigenous peoples are connected to these bigger challenges that we're all facing in the world.
Yeah.
Their fight for environmental protection, cultural preservation, social justice, it goes way beyond their communities.
Right. Their knowledge and their traditions, their connection to nature, they have lessons for all of us.
Yeah.
Especially now as we face things like climate change and biodiversity loss.
Exactly. And for you, the listener, I think these reports are a good place to start. To think about what's changed or hasn't changed for indigenous populations since the early 90s.
Yeah.
And what can we do individually and collectively to support them and make sure their voices are heard in the 21st century?
It feels like we've only just started to uncover all this,
You're right.
These reports cover such a huge range of indigenous experiences from all over the globe.
Yeah, and each region has its own unique history, its own cultural traditions, its own specific challenges.
Right.
But there's this common thread that runs through all of them.
What kind of common thread?
The fight for land rights. That's everywhere in these reports. You see it with the Sami in Scandinavia, the Kuna in Panama, the Banwan in the Philippines.
Yeah.
Indigenous peoples all over are battling to protect their ancestral lands from exploitation, encroachment, displacement.
And it's not just about the land itself, is it?
No, not at all.
It's about cultural survival, that connection to the land,
It's their identity.
their ability to keep their traditions alive, right?
Yeah, exactly. For indigenous peoples, land is not just a thing. It's not a commodity. It's the core of who they are.
It's everything.
It's their livelihood.
Yeah.
It's their very existence.
So how do these reports from back in the early 90s, how do they actually approach this whole complicated issue of indigenous land rights?
Well, one thing that's really emphasized is the need to recognize indigenous people's own knowledge systems and governance when we talk about managing land and resources. Like, for example, the report on the Inuit in Alaska.
Okay.
It talks about how the Marine Mammal Protection Act actually has this exception for Alaska Natives.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it allows them to hunt marine mammals for subsistence purposes.
So there's at least some acknowledgement in U.S. law that traditional practices should be respected.
Right, and the right to manage resources sustainably, which is a good thing, but unfortunately those examples are or were too few and far between.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, indigenous peoples had to fight against legal systems that were built on Western ideas of land ownership and resource management.
which didn't always fit with their traditions and values.
And you see this really clearly in the report on the Orang Asli in Malaysia.
Oh, yeah.
It explains how their customary land rights are often just ignored.
Right.
And they're facing threats from logging, plantations, development projects that are encroaching on their territories.
It's a constant struggle.
It is. It's this disconnect between the legal systems and the realities of how Indigenous people live.
Exactly.
It's a major source of conflict and injustice.
It is.
So it sounds like we need some big changes, right?
Yeah.
Legal reforms and greater recognition of Indigenous land rights at both the national and international level.
Absolutely. And that recognition can't just be symbolic.
All right.
It has to translate into real power, real control over their lands and resources.
So giving them a voice, letting them be part of the decision-making process.
Exactly. When decisions are being made about development, conservation, anything that affects their territories, they need to be at the table.
Yeah.
It's about respecting that free, prior, and informed consent. FPIC.
Yes, FTIC.
That's right.
And that's not just the responsibility of governments and international organizations. It's on all of us.
Us too.
Yeah, we need to learn about these issues, listen to Indigenous voices, support their fight for justice and self-determination.
This has been quite a journey.
It has.
It's amazing to see how interconnected all these issues are.
Yeah.
And it's clear that there's a lot more work to do to make sure that Indigenous people's rights are protected.
A lot of work. But, as we move forward, it's so important to remember that the future of Indigenous peoples is tied to the future of our planet. Their knowledge, their traditions, that connection to nature, they have so much to teach us.
You're right, they do.
They really do.
Well, we've explored a lot today, but I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought.
Okay.
How can we, each of us, contribute to a future where Indigenous peoples not just survive, but thrive?
That's a good question.
It's a question worth thinking about, and I hope it stays with you long after this deep dive.